Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for students of counselling and psychotherapy. Here are your hosts, Rory Lees-Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 38 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. And with me is published author, Mr. Ken Kelly. How are you doing, Ken?
Oh, I'm very well, thank you very much, Rory. Yeah, excited. The book is out. Thank you so much for all the comments that are coming in on the book. I'm absolutely overwhelmed by how well that's been going, how well it's been received, and we will touch on the book. If you have no idea what we're talking about, then you need to stay tuned to today's episode, because we are going to be making reference to the book today, because we're going to be covering some topics that kind of, link into the book naturally. Exciting episode today as well, because it's jam-packed. We're going to be starting off with something that comes up time and time again. And here's what I know about this. If you're studying to be a counsellor or a psychotherapist, this is going to underpin your practice, no matter where you are in the world. It is the law that governs the country that you live in. It is the legislation that will govern your practice. And we're going to be doing a bit of a dive into that, aren't we, today, Rory?
We are. We're going to look at the law, and we're going to look at certain laws that therapists may not be aware of. And that's the whole point of what we do in the Counselling Tutor Podcast, to shine a light into dark corners, Ken. That's what we do.
I like that. I'm writing that down as you say it. We're going into theory with Rory. It's a really important one. It comes from the person-centered approach to counselling by Mr. Carl Rogers. And it's a part of Carl Rogers' work that I thought stood out slightly from the rest of his work, because it's quite theory-based, and it is the 7 stages of process, where he explains what we might look for in a client as they move from stage 1, which is a fixed, rigid position, to stage 7, which is open and fluid. So from rigidity to fluidity. And you're going to be sharing some interesting stuff on the 7 stages of process, as you actually did in the lecture, the full lecture that you did on that, which is of course available in the Counselling Study Resource, Rory.
Absolutely. And it's one of my favourite pieces of Rogerian theory, because it's one that you can use in a number of ways. You can use it if you're writing assignments, to evidence a client's movements through the therapeutic field. And also you can use it in supervision.
Yes.
It's really, I think one of the really important things about learning theory is to develop a language that you can use with your supervisor, a common language. So when you're speaking about a certain stage or a certain condition that you're using, or any theory that you're using, you and your supervisor are speaking in a common language, so you're both fully understanding each other. I'm going to be talking a little bit about that in theory with Rory. And also, I have done a full lecture on the 7 stages of process, and I have to say I'm very pleased with it, Ken.
Yeah, and again, very well received. And if you are a member of the Counselling Study Resource, of course, you have access to that already. If you're not a member of the Counselling Study Resource, we will be giving you a direction of where to go and have a look at that. So, 7 stages of process. You mentioned taking that into supervision, and of course, writing your own notes. You can refer to the 7 stages of process as well. Just kind of gives you an idea of where your client is at, and you can see those moments of movements. Has the client moved? I'm looking forward to it. It's one of my favourite theories as well. And then we're going to end with endings.
I see what you did there, Ken.
You see how smart we are, Rory. We're going to end with endings in counselling, having a really good look at that. All different kinds of endings as well, because we have the fairy tale ending where a client comes in, there's great movement for this client, and they naturally come to an end and they go off into the sunset. We're happy, they're happy, but it doesn't always go that way. We can sometimes have unexpected endings, and it's about how we work with that, Rory.
Absolutely, and endings are really important. And I read recently that they are the most complained about part of counselling. People complain more to the BACP about bad endings or endings they don't know about than any other aspect in counselling. So, it would seem there's a bit of a deficit there. So again, we'll get our torch out and shine our light into that dark corner.
I like it. I've got the X-Files playing out in my head at the moment with the torch lights sweeping around in the dark room, and we're going to sweep it right on to counselling and the law. And what's really interesting is Rory is our content director at Counselling Tutor. He's the guy that goes out and finds out all the information to bring it to you. And I spend a lot of my time in the engine room, covered in soot, making sure that our website works and that our counselling study resource works and everybody can log in. But one of my jobs is to have a look at what people are searching for when it comes to counselling and psychotherapy. And one of the highest hit pages on our website is about counselling and the law, because you do cover it in your studies, but it's really important and it can sometimes be a bit tricky to get your head around.
Absolutely, Ken. And before I start this little preamble, just to be clear that this is for the UK. So the laws that I'm going to be talking about are for the UK. I know we have friends out there who listen to us in different countries, but it's a big task to get the law for every single country in the world as it relates to counselling. So this is going to be the UK. And the other thing is I'm not a lawyer, so this is how I interpret it. And we'll give you a link to a really good book written by Peter Jenkins, who's a teacher over here in Manchester, who's written a book on counselling and the law. But yes, we as counsellors, we have to abide by the law. So the first thing I'd like to say about that is the new BACP ethical framework that came into force, if that's the word in counselling. Not really. We all agreed to abide by that.
Came into effect.
Effect. Although I have to say that if you breach the ethical framework, you will feel the force of the sanction that comes your way. So yes, it came into force on the 1st of July 2016. And one of the things it says is that we must abide by the law. And it can be a bit of a minefield, Ken, the law, because students aren't lawyers. They're doing a counselling course, not a law degree. So I'm just going to mention some of the laws that are most common. And I think the first one is data protection. So when we're thinking of confidentiality, we have in this country something called the Data Protection Act. And it means that data needs to be stored safely and securely, and only the people who are able to access it under law access it. So we wouldn't put our notes online, for instance, because everybody could access it. So data protection is who has the right to access the client's notes. Well, the law says that the client has the right to access them.
Yeah.
So if the client says, "I'd like to know what you're writing about me," then you have to produce your notes. A coroner, should a tragedy occur and the client die, coroner can request your notes, and also a judge can ask for your notes with a court order.
Yeah.
So those are the three areas where your notes can be accessed, and of course the therapist can access the notes. Interestingly enough, Ken, if you're working for an agency, technically speaking, the agency can access your notes, because if you work for them, everything you do is theirs.
And it's a tricky area, isn't it? Specifically, when I remember when I was doing my placement, I was doing it under the umbrella of an agency, and the agency wanted me to use their system to put my notes on, and I didn't feel happy that everybody could access that, and I needed to negotiate that with them. But you're 100% right, and I guess if that is the case, it's very important that your client is aware of that, and you would cover that in your initial contracting when you mention confidentiality. And you're speaking now about data protection. And of course, data protection is going to cover your notes and how they are stored. But there's a hidden side to data protection that maybe people don't consider. And that is, even if somebody is not engaged with you in counselling, but they have touched base with you, they've got in contact with you, you're storing emails with their personal details in, or you've had a form on your website that somebody has filled in and submitted, that information is stored somewhere. And as soon as you are storing another individual's information, and that is being held online, you have to comply with the data protection laws. And of course, you can find more about this, and we'll put the link in the show notes of this episode, in the UK at ico.org.uk. That is who you go through to get that sorted out for your practice. And they also have a little test that you can do to see, do I need to have data protection policies and procedures in place, which you can do on their website, ico.org.uk.
Yeah, and this whole kind of discussion was generated by one of our Facebook group members, Natasha Jenkins. Now, our Facebook group it'll be 5,000. It is 5,000
oh my
people.
goodness.
So,
That's celebrate. Woohoo! I'm celebrating and I'm waiting. We're blowing the blowers. I'm wearing, I just have to describe this for everyone, a little paper party hat as we do this. I'm not. I've got to be congruent.
He's not. But if he had one, he would be. And yes, and if you want to join our little group of our happy band of brothers and sisters in the world of counselling and psychotherapy, then if you go to www.counsellingtutor.com, there's 2 L's in counselling. We spell it the kind of UK way. Click on the tab at the right-hand side. It says Facebook. It's a closed group. One of our moderators will let you in. And as you go in, you'll join our group and people post questions. And that's where we get the questions from. We get it from our Facebook group. And Natasha says she's having to write a paper on an agency and she's interested on the legal processes that an agency might have. So that's quite kind of slightly different. So if you're in an agency, the first thing I'd say is the agency's responsibility to have things like a data protection policy, insurance. No, you've got to, it's a legal requirement to have insurance if you're an agency. Also, they may very well, an agency may very well take the view that if a client says they're going to harm themselves or others, then you have to break confidentiality, because that might link in with the common law, which an agency would have to follow. And fire safety, I mean, the lists of laws is just endless, isn't it? I worked in a hostel for 5 years, supporting people, and it seemed that every Monday we had someone knock on the door saying, "Can I see your fire safety book? Can I see your heating?" Can I see this? Can I see it? Have you got your gas safety book? Have you got this? It was a parade of people who just came around just checking we were complying with the law. So I would say that if you're writing a paper like that, go to your policies and procedures, go to someone who's your practice manager or maybe someone who takes care of the policies and just ask. But there's a whole raft of legislation. But the ones that we're really interested in as counsellors, there's 3 main ones. One is the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which is consistently being updated. So if someone comes in and says that they're going to blow something up, or they know of someone who's going to blow something up, or any other act of terrorism, then you're legally obliged to break confidentiality for that. And you could do that actually by going on to Crime Stoppers, which is a UK anonymous helpline where you can phone up and report a crime anonymously.
What I would say with that, because it is a tricky one, and we are obligated to break confidentiality in that case. So knowledge of involvement in an act of terrorism, we have to. We don't have a choice in the matter. We've got to break confidentiality. And if you are going to break confidentiality anonymously, make sure you have that recorded so that if you need to defend that in court at some stage, when they say, how come you knew about this and you didn't say anything? And you go, I did. I made an anonymous phone call. You need to be able to have that trackable and evidenceable, because it is legislation. We do need to keep very close eye on that one.
Yeah. I'll go to the relevant authorities. You know, the other one is drug trafficking, and this is a perennial one that people sometimes get wrong. Drug trafficking is not selling the odd wrap of heroin or cocaine or all the other drugs that seem to be around at the moment. It is the bulk movement of drugs.
Yeah,
drug trafficking is where people are shipping in. Recently on the TV we saw holdalls washed up on the beach full of cocaine. That is drug trafficking, and you're legally obliged to break confidentiality for that, and also. For money laundering. And money laundering is where somebody has sold a lot of drugs and they have a big pile of cash in a suitcase and they don't know what to do with it. So what some people do is they open a fish and chip shop and pretend they've sold £1 million worth of fish and chips.
Good fish and chip shop.
Yeah, they're very busy. Maybe it's near a station. and that's how people get caught, because they put the money into a business, pretend that people have bought fish and chips, and then what happens is that someone looks at it and goes, yeah, I don't think that someone's going to do £1 million worth of fish and chips in Mosley. I'm just thinking of our local fish and chip shop, which is near the station. And people get raided for money laundering, and it is getting more difficult. So that's money laundering. But, technically under the BACP ethical framework, you have to comply with the law. So it could be read that if someone said, well, one of my problems I want to come to you about is I go and I steal Mars bars from, the supermarket, technically they're breaking the law. So it's an interesting one. One maybe to debate in your training groups, I would say.
Definitely. And when we're talking about money laundering, because that's an interesting one for me, because you don't have to watch the news for very long to see some headline story about another bank that has been had a fine imposed on them of many millions for money laundering activities. So it is something you may see from high business with somebody presenting. It's about having an understanding of what that is. And of course, we cover those in our training. If you're training in the UK, you're going to cover those the exclusions in confidentiality that we are bound by. But there are some that are maybe more hidden. Of course, we have the Child Protection Act, which we need to comply with. We have the protection of vulnerable adults. And it's worth having a look around to see what classifies somebody as a vulnerable adult. Because I can share from personal experience, you can have a very fit and healthy looking person who is of sound mind and body sitting in front of you, and they could fall under the umbrella of vulnerable adult because of the referral pathway that they came into you by. So it's worth knowing what that looks like so that you can comply with the laws. Can be tricky.
Yeah, it's interesting. And this might surprise you, Ken, but as of today, when we're making this podcast, which is March of 2016, there is no legal obligation to report child abuse.
You're just going to hear silence from me on that, Rory, because it's just...
I know.
But money laundering, yes. Come on,
money laundering, terrorism, or drugs trafficking, but there's no legal obligation. Now, I'm going to try and build around that. Okay, if you're working in an agency as a student, almost certainly you will have to, because the policies and procedures you follow say you've got to break confidentiality if it's harm to self, harm to others, or harm that you may do to others.
Yeah.
Every agency worth its salt will have that policy.
Yep. So
you have to abide by that policy. But as a private practitioner, which me and Ken are, there is absolutely no law that says we've got to disclose it. And I was absolutely amazed when I found that out, because I'd laboured under the impression, having been an educator for over a decade, that must be the law, but it's not.
Again, speechless. It's about priorities, and I think that the priorities seem a little bit, I guess, wonky when money is over a child's welfare.
Yeah, what I would say is that I would Google it, because there's a massive debate. There's a lot of principal therapists who agree with it, and it's this may be not the podcast, the section of the podcast to go over it. Maybe we'll revisit it, but there is some interesting justifications of it from a moral perspective, and I know there'll be people listening to this going, that cannot be right, and that's instinctively it feels like that for me. But when you read them, you are left with so do your research, have a look. But there are some people who say there's some very, very good reasons why that shouldn't happen, or why you'd have to be very, very thoughtful. But just to reiterate, if you're working in a school, if you're working in an agency, if you're working for an employment assistance program, look in the policies and procedures, because usually that will be covered. It's not the law, but it's their policy, and you have to follow it.
In the show notes of today's episode, we're going to put the link to Peter Jenkins's book, really worth having a read if you are based in the UK, studying to become a counsellor or a psychotherapist. It's going to be great to underpin your work in your assignments, and it's a good read anyway. It's heavy going. there's a lot of heavy stuff in there, but it's really worth having a read through it so that it's there. And you were speaking about something that is quite controversial there, Rory, when you were talking about child protection and the different views on that. And it leads us neatly into our next topic. It's Theory with Rory, and we're talking about the 7 stages of process. And as you mentioned that, Rory, you said, when you think about it, there's a feeling that comes up with you that is kind of, ooh, should it really be like that? Which is kind of a narrow view. It's your view from your own self-perception. But in going and looking at the information, you're saying, okay, hold on, maybe there are other opinions here. And that is a more fluid and a more open view. And it's exactly keying into what you're going to be covering right now.
Absolutely. And, there's a famous philosopher whose name escapes me, who says just because you hold a thought that you don't agree with, doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's a sign of a healthy mind to investigate contrary thoughts. Sometimes it's called paradoxical thinking, where you're thinking the unthinkable is the term. And the 7 stages of process was perhaps one of the most marvelous pieces of theory ever written in the lexicon of psychology. And you could quote me on that, because it gives a clear path, certainly in the person-centered approach, of how a client moves from a very fixed, rigid part of the world, where it's everybody else's fault, not mine, to a place where they can accept the world and be fluid within it. And it's a super piece of theory. You can use it in supervision, which I'll be talking about. You can use it in your class, and when you're looking at theory, and you can use it, and you'll have to use it almost certainly when you're writing your assignments. So I'm going to be focusing just a little bit on that. But I do have, Ken, a super lecture in the CSR library on the 7 stages of process, and I am mightily chuffed with it, I have to say.
As am I. It was an absolute pleasure to listen to it. And what you've done here is you've taken maybe a bite size of that full lecture. So without any further ado, let's get into that bite size of the 7 stages of process, Carl Rogers' theory, because it is Theory with Rory.
Counselling Theory with Rory Lees-Oakes.
Before I discuss the 7 stages of process, I'm going to try and put it into context. The 7 stages of process forms one of the 3 pillars of person-centered therapy, which all the other actions that person-centered therapists do rests on. And the first pillar is the 6 necessary and sufficient conditions, which Rogers talked about in the Consulting Journal of Psychology in 1957, where he talked about empathy, congruence, unconditional positive regard, which became known as the core conditions. There was 3 other conditions as well, 6 in total. And then he talked about the 7 stages of the process, which is effectively an observation how clients grow and develop and mature through a therapeutic engagement. And then he talked about the 19 propositions, which are effectively Rogers' theory of personality, how our personality forms and how we engage with the world. So I'm going to quote from Rogers' first book, where he put all these ideas together. Now, he did write a book called Client-Centered Therapy. I think it was in 1957. But I think in 1961, Rogers published a book called On Becoming a Person. And that was the first book where he put all these ideas together and introduced a complete therapy, I think, to his audience. So that's why that book is usually found in universities, college libraries. It's why it's on recommended reading lists, because it covers the entire panoply of Rogers' work. So I'm going to quote Rogers, and I'm going to quote from that particular book. And he said, individuals move, I began to see, not from fixity or homeostasis through change to a new fixity. Though such a process is indeed possible, but the more significant continuum is from fixity to changedness, from rigid structure to flow, from stasis to process. Now, as usual, Rogers couches everything he does in academic language, which on the first read can feel a bit inaccessible. What Rogers was basically saying here is that clients didn't move from one fixed position to another fixed position in therapy. On the contrary, clients grew from a position where they may be fixed in their ideas in the world, the world needs to change, it's not them, to a position where they live life on life's terms. In other words, they understand that sometimes life isn't fair, and they have to understand their own process and how their own actions influence the world around them. And that's the process of therapy. And he wrote it in 7 stages. Now, I always think that having an understanding of this 7 stages of process is a really good idea, and I'll share why that is. It's because you can develop a shared language with your supervisor. So if you're doing a person-centered course, if you have the 7 stages of process, you can share with your supervisor what stage you think the client's in. They can understand what you're talking about. They can either contradict that and say, I don't think it's this stage, I think it's the next stage. That gives you a good understanding and an underpinning if you're writing your case study. You see where I'm going here? And before you know it, you're talking in the language of therapy. You've learnt a new language, and one which is easy then to start to put into your assignments. So I'm going to go through the stages, and I'm going to discuss a little bit about how it relates to practice. I think that's important too. So stage 1 is a client who you'd probably never see. And the reason for that is they think they don't need therapy, everyone else does. We've all met people who believe it's the world that needs to change and they're okay. If only the world would change, their life would be so much easier. And there's a sense of incongruence about this because obviously their life isn't going to, the world isn't going to change for them. They will have to fit in with the world as it is. And we don't usually see clients in stage 1 or indeed stage 2. Clients become a little less rigid, but they're usually talking totally about external events and not about themselves. Now, it's interesting, there's a distinction here. In private practice, I'm a private practitioner now, I would never see clients in stage 1 or 2. And the reason for that is because clients who are paying for therapy want therapy. Clients in stage 1 or 2 may not want it, so they wouldn't come and pay for something they didn't want. However, for those of you who are in agencies, it's very possible that you may be referred clients in stage 1 and 2. And if that's the case, it's very possible they may have 1 or 2 sessions and then DNA and never return. And I think that a really good referrer, someone who really knows how to refer and allocate clients, would be able to separate people in stage 1 and 2 and maybe move them to a different helping professional as opposed to send them for counselling because they just might not be ready for it. So we usually see clients in stage 3. So the clients that you'll be able to work with and may stay longer in therapy and engage with it and are motivated more to the point are in stage 3. And clients in this stage, they will discuss themselves, but they might discuss themselves as an object. They may very well talk about themselves in the third person. Jane said this, Jane said that, and also talk a lot about the past and the future, never the here and now. And part of the therapist's role is to gently help a client talk about themselves and also how they experience their feelings in the here and now. Also, they might not own stuff. They may have a tendency to be incongruent. In other words, not understand how their actions impact on other people. However, they're motivated. They've come to therapy, and they start to move as the therapist works with that and tries to bring the client into the here and now. They go into maybe what's called stage 4. Now, this is the middles in counselling, really. And they start to discuss deeper feelings and they start to develop a relationship with the counsellor. So this really is middles, where there's trust built, there's a relationship, and the client may start telling you things that they wouldn't have told you in the first few sessions, or anyone else for that matter. This is where there's so much trust built that they feel safe to share their world without judgment or criticism. They feel accepted. As that stage starts to take hold, clients may very well move very quickly into stage 5, and they're now taking responsibility for themselves. They are growing in acceptance that the world may not be a fair place, and that indeed life isn't fair. And they also might be seeing to some extent how their actions impact on others. So they're owning more stuff. They're using the word I say this, I say that. And as that happens, then they develop again, and they may go into stage 6. Now, at stage 6, you would only see that, in my view, if you had a long-term relationship with a client. Most clients leave at stage 5, and the reason for that is because the sessions come to an end if it's fixed sessions. But clients with a longer engagement, they may then start to show more acceptance of other people. And they develop unconditional positive regard for themselves and for others. And it's actually at that point where clients don't really need any more therapy. They've arrived at a point where they're accepting of themselves, they're congruent, and also they are accepting of others. And as I say, it's very seldom you'll see a client in stage 6, because that stage is one where they're taking what they've learned in therapy into the outside world, and they are practicing what they've talked about in the sessions. Now, stage 7 is an interesting one because it literally connects with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This is self-actualization. In stage 7, they show a lot of empathy towards other people. They can see other people's frames of reference. They can see that they're not the only people who exist in the space, in the relational space. So they can be accepting of others. And they can control, to a great extent, or to an ultimate extent, their own emotional regulation. They know themselves really well. And again, in therapy, you'd hardly ever see a client in that stage because they'd have left. That they would have been. This is something they would develop through their own philosophical inquiries, their own reflective abilities that have been developed in person-centered therapy. So that is my little journey in person-centered therapy. Now, if you want to know more, I've done an hour's lecture on the 7 stages of process, and that can be viewed in the CSR study resource, if you remember. And it really is an excellent lecture, and it's got slides and PowerPoints and really good examples of what clients might say in each of the stages. So that ends my presentation on the 7 stages of the process. But let me ask you a question. As you're going through the stages in Ken's handout, maybe wonder if it might be useful to have a look at which stage you think you're in. And then you could take that into your personal development group as a discussion point.
Really insightful as always, Rory. Thank you very much. And of course, if you got something from that and you want to dive a little bit deeper, because it is a fairly complex theory on the surface, but when you dive under it and you start to understand it, it really makes sense. And if you want to do that deep dive, the place to do that is in the Counselling Study resource. You can go and listen to Rory's complete lecture and get the downloads and the slide pack for that as well on the 7 stages of process. And how do you get into the Counselling Study resource? Well, it's very, very simple. You go to counsellingtutor.com, and right there on the homepage are all the directions of how you can get to the Counselling Study resource. But there is a download that you can get just from today's show notes. And of course, today's show notes, this is episode 38. To find today's show notes, go to the same website. It's counsellingtutor.com. Click on the podcast tab. It's right at the top. And just go to episode 38 and there is a download. The download that we're giving away is a chapter from my book. I wrote a book called Basic Counselling Skills, a Student Guide. And in that book, there is a chapter on the 7 stages of process. Not as theoretical, Rory, as you've brought it across. And as you bring it across in your lecture, it is more looking at how we will see it from a therapist's point of view when we are in the therapy room with the client, what we might look out for and what we might see in the changes within the client. So you can get that. It's my chapter of my book, and you can download that by just going to show notes of episode 38. So go grab it
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you what I like about that chapter, because I've read your book, Ken, and it's just fantastic, fabulous, is that you don't have to be studying person-centered therapy to get a benefit from what Ken's written, because it gives you a indication about how accepting clients are about their experience of the world. And it fits with anything. It fits with person-centered therapy, but it gives you a really good indication of how clients are now mixing and accepting and embracing the world around them. So, really, really useful no matter what modality of therapy you're studying.
Awesome. And as I guess we come out of that, we're looking at endings in counselling. And endings can sometimes be tricky. As painted in the beginning, you can have the fairy tale ending where everything goes wonderfully. And then sometimes when we're studying, that's kind of what we expect an ending might look like. And it can look very different when you're in practice. And picture this, for example, where you are there as the therapist and you have a real relational depth with the client you've been working with. You may be at session 8 or 9, and they just never come back. No message, no indication, they just never come back. What are you left with? Think back in your life of a time that you may have had an ending. It could have been a job loss. It could have been breakup of a relationship. It could have been a loss of a loved one. If you think about that ending, it is quite possible that those feelings are easy to key into right now in the here and now, despite that being pretty far back in your past, because endings are something that we as human beings carry with us quite a distance.
Absolutely, Ken. And we're talking about our old friend transference again, aren't we?
Oh, yes.
Hello, transference, my old friend. There could be a song in that somewhere. And in fact, it can be that we replay our own endings, the unsatisfactory endings, should a client, and not as we, and this is the key thing, isn't it? Not as we hoped it would. If the client's ended, then it's ended for them, and we're in the service of the client. So, that's okay for them. But yeah, I can think of some endings that could be very, very tricky. You've discussed one, maybe you get a phone call from someone and your client's died.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And you're talking about how that is for us, and we need to look at endings in our own lives to be able to understand that and how we deal with endings, to know thine self. But at the same time, what's it like for our client? What are endings like for our client? And Rory, you've shared this before, and we were speaking about it just in the run-up to today's podcast when we were looking over our topics. So many complaints are levied to the BACP around the topic of endings from clients.
Absolutely, and I think that's about planning. If you're doing short therapy, maybe 6 sessions, maybe 12. I know that's becoming the norm in placements now. Really, you should be talking about endings at the beginning, at the contracting stage, and you do that by saying we have 6 sessions.
Yeah.
And I would, in a short engagement, when we get to 2, just say, well, we've got another 4 sessions. And when you get to the middle, you've got another 3 sessions left. Always making the client aware, because with short-term therapy, sometimes the client, I'm not saying needs to be pushed, but has to be as aware as you are that there's a short amount of time and they need to prioritize what they want to bring.
It's interesting as you're saying that. Something's just bubbling up for me and I just want to share it right now. The immediacy, here it is. And that is that I remember reading somewhere that there's some research done on that an ending can actually be helpful to a client in bringing them to movement faster. When they see an ending coming up, I better bring this stuff then. So there can be good reasons for acknowledging that ending. But I think what you're saying there, Rory, is that ending is a process. It's not something that just happens right at the end where somebody walks in and you go, well, it seems like you got what you came for. Thank you very much. When you first came into that first session, you said you wanted to get this out of therapy. You've just said now you're exactly there. Thank you very much. Been great seeing you. Cheerio. The end.
Yeah. Ow. That is not how we do it.
No, sudden abrupt.
Sudden and abrupt and frightening. It can be very, very, very scary. So, it's about planning. And also, I think that even if you're doing long-term engagements, not all therapy is 6 or 12 sessions. I was speaking to someone yesterday who's doing open-ended, is to have a regular review.
Definitely.
A regular review, 6-week review. There's some people who disagree with me on this, but when I always taught 6-week review. You have a review after 6 weeks, see where the client is, and then you can move on, and then you do another review in 6 weeks. Doesn't mean what's been talked about can't be revisited, but it gives you an idea of what's been covered, where the client is. And the other thing, Ken, is holidays. When I was training, I was told that you give the client 1 week's notice for every month you've been working with them.
Yeah.
So if you've been working with someone for 4 months, you give them 4 weeks notice. And in fact, if I start when I was at the school, because there's a lot of I use the word holiday in its broader sense, because a lot of teachers work on the holidays when the students aren't in. I think I'll say that when the students aren't in. And I used to say I'm aware that you're on half term here. So I get my diary out. We'd start in 3 weeks. It'd be a break. So I'd tell them right at the beginning. So they have the choice of regulating what they want to bring.
Yeah. I agree with you. There's different flavors of endings, and a holiday is one of them. Even though it's really a break, it can feel like an ending to a client. Potentially, I'm not saying for all clients, it can feel like that support that they really count on is suddenly pulled away from them. And it's about working to that ending, even if it is going to be a break. And within my own practice for things like holidays, when I know, my client knows. And I put that across, suggesting, I'm not suggesting you will still be coming for sessions with me then. That's going to be up to you. But I just wanted to make you aware that I will be away for such a period. And I will give that as far in advance as I know that it is there, because it's about those planning for the endings, even if it's just going to be a short break, and acknowledging that process.
Yes, I mean that's exactly right. It's not saying you're going to be here in a month or 2 months or whatever, but it's about good practice and due diligence. And one plea really is that I've known therapists through the years who are a bit ashamed to say, I'm going to miss that client. I feel a bit of loss with this client going. I think that's okay.
Yep.
That's if my opinion is worth anything, I think that's okay, because you're building a relationship. It is a unique engagement between two human beings, therapy.
Yep.
And it may very well be that when the client finishes, it's like, I feel really sad. I won't be seeing that person again. That's to take to supervision, exploited supervision. And if it persists, it's one for personal therapy.
Agreed. And there's another side to endings as well. And I want you to imagine something for me, because we started this off by saying, think about an ending that you have had in your life that may have been at some level traumatic, at least emotional, something that you can key into in the here and now. But now I want you to key into something else for me. Think about something that you were in. It could have been a relationship or any kind of situation where you just wished it would end, but it just dragged on and on and on. And maybe an example of that is somebody who came around to dinner and you were tired and you wanted to go to bed and they just wouldn't leave. What were you feeling in that? It could have been a relationship you were in that you were unhappy in and didn't feel that you were able to say you wanted out of it. It could have been a job that you felt trapped in, something that you wished would end and it just carried on and on. And we need to be aware that that is as dangerous as pulling the rug. Keeping a client in a counselling relationship where it is no longer appropriate for them to be there, where it is no longer therapeutic. And we need to acknowledge endings as counsellors, as psychotherapists. We need to have the courage to reflect back and say, as you're saying that, I'm recognizing that when you first came in, you mentioned this is exactly what you were looking for. And it may well be that this is the beginning of our relationship, maybe approaching an end. And of course, I'm not pulling the sessions from you right now, but I am suggesting maybe it's time for us to look at that. Yeah,
absolutely. One final play. I think one of the things that is unspoken about with therapists and endings is the therapist's attachment style. I think that if you've got a very avoidant, dismissive attachment style, then it might be that the ending means more to the client than it does to you.
Yeah.
Because with people with avoidant, dismissive attachment styles, once people go, it's like, well, they've gone. That's okay. Yeah, if someone has got an ambivalent attachment style, it may be that there's this sense of hoping the client will go, and then all of a sudden, oh, please don't leave me. And it could, and I think that in training, and I know when I used to train, Ken, we used to do attachment. it wasn't in the curriculum, I have to hasten to say, but we used to do attachment because it's just so important. If you know your own attachment style, then you can manage it. Not asking you to alter yourself, but to be aware that your feeling about endings and how you engage with people may be massively different to your clients. So important to know your own attachment style.
It's so interesting as you're saying that, Rory. I'm just reminded time and time again how important self-development is, because it is in self-development that you find that out, and how personal development groups are so important in our training. It's not just the skills, it's not just the theory. It all links together. It all comes together as a whole, as I hope this episode has done. This has been a cracking episode. That's a UK term meaning really good. You see, I'm using the slang now, Rory. We started off with having a look at the law that underpins us as counsellors, psychotherapists. We looked at the 7 stages of process in theory with Rory, and we end with endings. We ended with endings today. And of course, it's interesting that, and this wasn't planned because we kind of got the topics together before we went into this, but I just want to plug my book again. I'm going to mention it again. It's called Basic Counselling Skills, a Student Guide. It is available from counsellingtutor.com. And the last chapter is on endings in counselling. So that is certainly covered in the book. But it's certainly been an interesting, engaging and worthwhile episode for me, Rory.
It has. And as we always say at the end of this, just like the episode of Hill Street Blues, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode on our website at www.counsellingtutor.com.